The man behind the counter didn't lower his voice. That was the thing Celia would remember later, not the words themselves, but the volume. How he made sure every person in that diner could hear every syllable. Cards declined. The cashier held it out between two fingers like it was something he'd found on the floor. You got another one? Or what? The man in the black wool coat reached for the card without looking up. Run it again. Ran it twice. Then run it a third time. Sir, the cashier set the card on the counter with a little click. Final. I'm going to need you to step aside. That was when the man in the booth nearest the window read baseball cap. Third cup of coffee muttered something just loud enough. Dead beat. And the woman across from him smiled into her mug. And a teenage boy at the far end of the counter turned to look, because teenagers always turn to look. And within 4 seconds, the entire diner had done the quiet, collective thing that diners do at 3 in the morning when something humiliating happens to a stranger. They all pretended not to notice while noticing everything. Celia Hartwell had been watching from her stool at the end of the counter since the moment the man walked in. She'd been a nurse long enough to know how to read a person without staring. You learned that fast in emergency intake, the difference between someone who was dangerous and someone who was scared. The man in the black coat was neither. He was tired. Not sleepy tired, the other kind. The kind that lived behind a person's eyes when they'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. He was somewhere between 40 and 50. Hard to tell exactly. He had the kind of face that had seen weather, not just outdoor weather, but the kind decades of being in rooms where things were decided. His jaw was set. His hands were still. When the cashier slid the card back across the counter, the man looked at it for one long second, and Celia watched something move through his expression. Not anger, not embarrassment, exactly more like a person recalculating. Quietly, behind walls. My wallet was taken, he said. On the street, 40 minutes ago. This card was in my coat pocket, not the wallet. I'm telling you, someone has already attempted charges on whatever they pulled. And I'm telling you, the cashier said, leaning forward with both hands flat on the counter, machine says, no. The man in the red cap said something else then. Celia didn't catch it completely, but she caught the word story and the word always, and that was enough. The man in the black coat turned and looked at him. Just looked. No expression at all. The kind of silence that should have been a warning to anyone paying attention. The man in the red cap looked back at his coffee. But the damage was done. There were 11 other people in that diner. All of them had heard. All of them had drawn their conclusions in the way that people draw conclusions at 3 in the morning when they're tired and cold and haven't eaten yet. Fast, flat, and without charity. Celia looked at the counter in front of the man. Scrambled eggs, toast, a cup of coffee. The plate had been brought out before the card was run. Standard diner sequence. He'd eaten maybe a third of it. She opened her purse. She knew exactly what was in it. $19.40. She'd counted it in the car before she walked in. Because she did that, now counted before she spent, always. The way her mother had taught her. The way her mother had failed to teach herself. Some. $19.40. The eggs and toast came to $6.80 with tax. She'd been planning to spend 6 of it on her own plate and leave the rest for the week. Payday wasn't until Thursday. Today was Monday, or technically Tuesday now. 3:17 in the morning Tuesday. Evan needed his refill by Wednesday. The albuterol, 12 years old, and his lungs still treated winter air like a personal insult. Prescription ran $42 without the discount card until the light changed, and she hadn't been able to find the discount card since she'd reorganized the kitchen drawer last week, which meant it was probably in the kitchen drawer still. Press until the light changed, just buried under the rubber bands and the dead batteries and the birthday candle Shen kept meaning to throw away. $19.40. She pulled it out. All of it, counted it onto the counter in front of her 2 5s, a 4 2/4, and then she stood up and walked 7 stools down and set it next to the man's plate. Cashier blinked at her. She didn't look at the man in the black coat. She looked at the cashier. That cover it? The cashier looked at the money. Yeah, that covers it. Then we're done, Celia said. She turned and walked back to her stool. Her plate was still there. Her coffee was still there. She had 40 cents left to her name and 4 days. and 4 days until Thursday, and an asthmatic 12-year-old sleeping at home with a rescue inhaler that was running its last reserves. And she sat back down and picked up her fork and took a bite of her eggs because they were getting cold. The diner had gone completely silent. Then it unsilenced itself. The way diners do, in the gradual return of low conversations, and the scrape of silverware, and the man in the red cap said nothing more, and held the pressure until the light changed, and the teenage boy at the end of the counter looked back at his phone, and life resumed its ordinary shape. Except for the man in the black coat. He hadn't moved. Celia could feel him looking at her. She didn't turn around. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know. I'm going to pay you back." "You don't have to. I want to." She looked at him then. He was turned halfway on his stool, watching her with pale gray eyes that were doing the thing. She recognized the reevaluation thing, the recalculating thing, like she'd presented him with a variable he hadn't expected. And he was running the numbers to figure out what category she belonged to. "That's not why I did it," she said. "I understand that. Do you?" He studied her for a moment. "You work nights." It wasn't a question. She didn't ask how he knew. There was no mystery in it. She was sitting in a diner at 3 in the morning, in the clothes she'd changed into after her shift, the ones she kept in her locker, because going home in scrubs after 12 hours made her feel like she was carrying the hospital home with her. She'd been doing that for 6 years. Clothes were ordinary jeans, a gray sweater, boots with a worn left heel, but she'd kept them folded in the same locker. So long they had the specific tired look of clothes that had been resting against a metal shelf for most of their life. "Hospital," she said, because there was no reason not to. 1. Marlow County. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away somewhere. "I'm Cassian Rourke," he said. She took another bite of her eggs. "Celia Hartwell." He didn't shake her hand. She didn't offer it. "It wasn't that kind of conversation, Celia," he said. "Thank you. I didn't do it for you," she said. He looked at her for another second. Then he nodded, just once, small, the way people nod, when they've heard something that surprised them in a way they didn't expect. And then he turned back to his food and finished the last of his eggs. And Celia finished hers. And they didn't speak again. When she left, she didn't look back. She found out later, much later, from a source she hadn't expected, that he sat in that diner for another 20 minutes after she left. Just sat there, staring at the counter where her money had been. What Celia Hartwell knew about herself at 3:17 on a Tuesday morning in November was this. She was 27 years old. She was 3 months behind on the electric bill and 5 months behind on a debt she couldn't talk about out loud yet. She hadn't slept more than 5 consecutive hours in 11 days. And she had just given away the last $19 she had in the world to a stranger whose name she immediately forgot. What she didn't know was anything about Cassian Rourke. She didn't know that his name moved through certain circles in Baltimore's eastern harbor. The way a cold front moves, you felt it before you saw it. You felt it in the way people adjusted their posture, in the way conversations changed direction, in the way a room would redistribute its weight when he walked into it, and held the pressure until the light changed. She didn't know that controlled the shipping operations along a 4-mile stretch of waterfront through a network of arrangements that the police had been trying to map for 11 years without quite getting the edges of it right. She didn't know that the men who worked for him, and there were many of them, in many places, doing many things operated under a single principle that Cassian Rourke had never written down but had communicated clearly enough that it had become something like gospel. There are things we don't touch. Hospitals, children, the elderly, medication. These were the untouchable categories. Anyone who moved against them moved against him. She didn't know any of that. She drove home in her 10-year-old Civic with the heater that only worked on the highest setting, which meant the car was either frigid or unbearable with no middle ground. And she chose unbearable because it was November. And she thought about Evan's inhaler, and she thought about the electric bill, and she thought about the $19. And then she stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it wasn't going to change it. And she'd learned a long time ago, watching her mother. Mostly that the difference between surviving and not surviving was sometimes just whether you could make yourself stop counting things you couldn't fix at 3 in the morning. She got home at 3:52. The apartment was quiet. She checked on Evan out of habit. He was asleep, with his arm thrown over his face the way he always slept, his chest rising and falling in the particular shallow rhythm that she'd learned to read the way other people read a clock. Okay. She went to bed without eating anything else. She was asleep by 4:15. By 4:43, a man named Silas Venn was standing outside her building in the dark, looking at the name on the buzzer panel. She didn't know that either. Silas Venn had been with Cassian Rourke for 17 years. In all that time, he had been asked to do many things, some of them ordinary, some of them not. Some of them the kind of thing that you didn't describe accurately in polite company. He had never, in 17 years, been called at 4 in the morning and asked to find a nurse. Found her in 11 minutes. Cassian had given him the plate number. Silas ran it through contact at the DMV. A favor that worked in both directions, always had a name and address before Celia had finished her drive home. He stood outside the building on Redmond Street, looking at the buzzer marked C, Hartwell 4B, and then he sent Cassian a text with the address and went and sat in his car. Cassian replied in less than a minute, "Don't knock. Just watch." So Silas sat and watched. Nothing happened. The building was quiet. A cat appeared from somewhere, assessed him with the particular contempt that cats reserve for people sitting in cars at 4 in the morning, and left. At 5:15, Silas sent another text. "She's inside." Light in the 4th floor window went out around 4:20. Cassian replied, "Come back in the morning. Find out what she needs." Silas looked at that message for a moment. Then he typed back, "What does that mean, exactly?" Cassian didn't answer right away. When he did, it was 3 words: "Use your judgment." Silas Venn had many skills. Using his judgment was one of them. He put the phone in his jacket pocket and drove to a 24-hour place he knew, and got himself a coffee and sat there until 6:30, when the city started its slow morning process of remembering it was alive. By 8:15, he had the rest of it. Celia Ann Hartwell, 27, licensed RN, 5 years at Marlow County Hospital, night shift, Ward 4 general intake, with periodic rotation into pediatric support. Prior address on Leland Avenue, moved 14 months ago. Current address Redmond Street. One dependent listed on the lease application, Evan Michael Hartwell, age 12, described as a sibling. No parents listed. Silas found the mother through the hospital's own public records obituary, filed in the public database 18 months ago. Margaret Hartwell, 51, died following complications from late-stage lung disease. Medical debt attached to the estate, substantial. An amount that Silas stared at for a moment before he wrote it down, because it was the kind of number that looked wrong in the context of a woman who was leaving behind a 26-year-old daughter and a 12-year-old boy. The debt hadn't been discharged. It had been assumed. He knew what that meant without needing to look further. He looked further anyway, because Cassian would want the full picture. The name attached to the debt transfer was a company called Meridian Solutions, LLC, which had a registered address in a suite at a downtown office building, and an almost total absence of any footprint that suggested it did anything other than hold debt, which meant someone had bought the debt, which meant someone now owned it, which meant that whatever Celia Hartwell was paying every month or not paying, given the 3 months of late electric notices that were a matter of public utility record, she was paying it to a man or a company that had specifically gone looking for medical debt to purchase from grieving families. Silas had been in and around the criminal world for long enough that very little surprised him anymore. This surprised him. Not the mechanism, he knew the mechanism. It was the specificity of it, the patience of it, the way it waited until the worst moment of a person's life, and then slid in under the door. He sent everything to Cassian. Cassian read it in less than 4 minutes and called him. "She refused the money," Silas said, before Cassian could start. "I know. You already tried?" "I had someone drop an envelope this morning." Silas was quiet for a second. "She sent it back?" "She left it on the front step with a note." "What did the note say?" There was a pause. It said, "Accepting this would turn what I did into a transaction." "I don't want it to be a transaction." Silas thought about that. Thought about the nurse he'd been reading about. For the past 3 hours, the electric bill, the debt, the kid with the bad lungs, the dead mother, and he thought about a person who had $19 to their name and still managed to have a principle about it. Huh, he said. Yeah, Cassian said. There was a silence between them that had the quality of two people sitting with something neither of them knew what to do with yet. What do you want to do? Silas asked. Cassian was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had something in it that Silas hadn't heard in a very long time. Something that was trying to find the right shape for a memory. There was a nurse, Cassian said. When I was 8, I was sick, bad sick, the kind where you don't know for a while how it's going to go. We were broke. My mother couldn't cover the medication they were prescribing. I don't know exactly what happened, because I was 8 and I was feverish, and half the time I didn't know where I was. He paused. But someone paid for it. Someone on the night staff. I don't know who. My mother never found out either. By the time I was well enough to ask, whoever it was had rotated off the ward. Silas didn't say anything. She didn't ask for anything, Cassian said. Nobody ever found out who it was. She just did it. And then I got better. Another silence. Celia Hartwell has the same hands, Cassian said quietly. And then, as if he'd said something too personal, he pulled back from it, the same way of doing things. What do you want to do? Silas asked again. Nothing yet, Cassian said. Just watch and find out about the debt, all of it. Who's holding it? How much? What the structure looks like. You think there's something off about it? I think that amount of debt doesn't just sit there waiting for someone to assume it without a reason. Find me the reason. Silas wrote himself a note. And the nurse? Don't approach her. Don't let her see you. She refused the money, which means she'll refuse help if it looks like help. If she needs something, we'll find another way. He paused. She won't know it's from me, he said. She can't know it's from me. Otherwise, the whole thing comes exactly what she said. She didn't want it to be. Transaction, Silas said. Yeah, Cassian said. Transaction. He hung up. Silas sat in his car outside Celia's building for another 10 minutes. Kat came back, assessed him again, left again. Kid on a bicycle came out of the building's side entrance, 12 or 13 and slight, wearing a blue jacket and a backpack, and walked to the corner and stood there for what turned out to be a school bus. Silas watched him. The kid coughed once while he waited. The particular kind of cough that had a chest-deep quality to it. He pulled a small inhaler from his jacket pocket and used it with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing that since before he could remember. Pocketed it again. Bus came. He got on. Silas wrote one more thing in his notes. Then he drove away. Celia woke up at noon with the specific disorientation of someone who has slept day and can't immediately find the edges of the day. She lay there for 30 seconds, listening to the apartment, the radiator ticking, a siren somewhere distant, the muffled sound of a television from the unit below, before she remembered the $19. And then she was fully awake. She lay there one more minute anyway, just to get it over with. Then she got up. Evan had left a note on the kitchen table. He did that. Left notes had started doing it after their mother died, as if he'd decided that the written word was more reliable than the spoken one. Went to Marcus's. Back by 4. There's still cereal. Underneath, in the smaller handwriting he used when he wanted to add something. He wasn't sure she'd want to hear. We're almost out of the inhaler. She already knew that. Kitchen keens. She stood at the kitchen counter in her sock and drank a glass of water and looked at the note and thought about the 40 cents in her wallet, which was not enough for anything, and the 4 days until Thursday, which was too many days for nothing. Her phone buzzed. Work. A text from the charge nurse on Ward 4. Head count is short tonight. Can you pick up an extra shift? Double time after 8. She typed back, yes. She put the phone down, picked it up again, put it down. The electric bill was on the counter. Third notice. She turned it face down. There was a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. She looked through the peephole, a habit she'd had since childhood. Her mother's voice always looked Celia. Always. And saw a man she didn't recognize standing in the hallway. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, compact and still, with the particular quality of someone who spent a lot of time standing in hallways waiting for doors to open. He was holding something, an envelope. She didn't open the door. I'm not interested, she said through it. Ms. Hartwell. His voice was even unhurried. I'm not selling anything. What are you doing then? A beat. I work for a pharmaceutical assistance foundation. We partner with hospitals in the area. Your name came up in a routine. No, silence, Ms. Hartwell. I don't know what this is, she said through the door, but I've had a very specific kind of morning, and I don't have the bandwidth for it right now. I'm going to ask you to leave. Another pause, then the sound of something being set on the floor gently, not dropped. I'll leave information, the man said, in case you change your mind. There's no obligation. She heard his footsteps move away. She waited a full 2 minutes before she opened the door. The envelope was on the floor. She picked it up. Inside, a card with a phone number, a pamphlet for something called the Hartwell Children's Asthma Resource Fund. Rex's. She stopped reading immediately because her name was on it. Her name, and that didn't make any sense. And a voucher for a 90-day supply of albuterol, no cost, from a pharmacy 4 blocks away. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she put the card and the pamphlet back in the envelope. She kept the voucher because Evan needed the medication, and she couldn't afford the medication. Wit, and whatever this was, whatever this meant, she'd figure it out later, and her brother needed to breathe. In the meantime, she leaned against the doorframe and looked out at the empty hallway. Cassian Rourke, she said out loud. To no one, to the empty hallway. Just to say it. She didn't know yet how right she was. She didn't know yet what that name meant, or what it was about to cost her, or how deep the water was that she was already standing in water that had nothing to do with him, that had been rising around her for months, that she'd been pretending not to notice, in the same desperate way that people pretend not to notice things they can't fix yet. She went back inside. She started getting ready for her shift. Outside on Redmond Street, the November wind came off the harbor, cold and constant, moving through the city the way it always did, indifferent to what it passed through, indifferent to what it left behind. She went back inside. She started getting ready for her shift. And that was the last ordinary thing Celia Hartwell did for a very long time. The hospital, at 9 on a Tuesday night, had its own specific gravity. Not the daytime hospital, the daytime version was loud, administrative, full of the friction of people in a hurry. The night version was quieter in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of a place that had learned to hold its breath. Celia had worked nights long enough that she didn't notice it anymore, except on the nights when it shifted. When the quiet changed quality, became something thinner, more watchful, and then she noticed it the way you notice a sound stopping that you'd forgotten was there. Tonight the quiet felt thin. She couldn't have said why exactly. Nothing looked different. Ward 4 was running at normal capacity. Supply room was locked. The charge desk was staffed. Everything was where it was supposed to be. But Agatha Bell was awake. Agatha was 73. Agatha's third cardiac monitoring stay in 18 months, and she had the particular quality of very old people who had stopped performing sleep for anyone's benefit. When Celia came through on her first round at 9:40, Agatha was sitting up in her bed with her hands folded on top of the blanket, watching the door. You're late tonight, Agatha said. I'm exactly on time, Celia said. I meant late coming to see me. Celia checked her chart. Blood pressure had been elevated at 7, come down by 8:30. Fluid intake was fine. She made a note without looking up. How's the chest? The chest is the same as it's been for 3 years, Agatha said. Tired. That's normal. I know it's normal. I didn't say it wasn't. Agatha watched her write. Someone was in the supply room again. Celia's pen stopped. She looked up. Agatha's room was directly across the hall from the auxiliary supply closet, the one that was supposed to hold overflow stock, bandages, extra IV lines, the kind of inventory that moved slowly, enough that nobody checked it every day. Celia knew that room. She knew the lock on it had been replaced 3 months ago with a newer model, which she'd thought at the time was an infrastructure update, and had not thought about since. When? She said. Little after 8, Agatha said. I wasn't sleeping. I heard the cart, the one with the wheel that catches, and I looked out. Door was open. Light was on inside. She paused. It was the head nurse. Nora. I don't know her name. Tall woman. Dark hair going gray at the front. Agatha considered that. Yes. Celia looked down at the chart in her hands. She wasn't looking at it. She was buying herself 3 seconds to think without her face, doing anything she didn't want it to do. Was she alone? She asked. No, there was a delivery person. Young man. He had a hand truck. What was on the hand truck? Crate, Agatha said. Medium-sized. The kind that has the foam inserts for bottles. She looked at Celia steadily. I've been in this room a lot of hours. I know what a medication crate looks like. Celia set the chart down on the bedside table. Agatha, she said carefully, how many times have you seen this? The old woman's expression didn't change, but something in it settled the way a person looks when they've finally been asked the question they've been waiting for. Enough, she said, that I stopped being surprised by it. Celia finished her round. She did it correctly, the right rooms, the right intervals, the right notes, the right responses to the right questions. She did all of it on autopilot while a separate, quieter part of her brain sat with what Agatha had said and turned it over and looked at its edges. At 10:50, she walked past the auxiliary supply room. The door was locked. Light was off. Nothing unusual. Kept walking. At 11:30, she came back. She used the master key that all ward nurses carried, the one that opened the general supply areas, not the pharmaceutical lock boxes. Those had their own separate system, and she went inside and turned on the light. The shelves were mostly as expected. Bandage rolls, IV tubing, saline bags, the kind of inventory that accumulated and thinned at the normal rate. Nothing obviously missing, except she stood in front of the third shelf and looked at it for a long time. Pharmaceutical overflow section, the one designated for non-narcotic prescription stock that was waiting to be transferred to the main dispensary, was sparse in a way that didn't match the intake. Logs she'd been reading for the past 8 months. She knew those logs. She'd worked this ward long enough that she had a sense of what the stock levels should look like without having to calculate them. The antibiotic stock alone was at maybe 60% of what it should be for this time of month. The respiratory medications were lower. The cardiac support line was almost empty. She looked at the inventory tag on the shelf. The numbers on it said the levels were normal. She looked at the shelf, then she looked at the tag again. The numbers on the tag and the physical stock in front of her were not the same numbers. Someone was keeping 2 sets of records. She turned the light off. She turned F and locked the door and walked back to the charge desk and sat down and stared at her own hands for a moment. They were steady. She was aware of them. They were steady. She was aware of them being steady in a way she wouldn't have been if they were shaking. It was the kind of steadiness that came from suppression rather than calm, kind her body produced when it had made a decision before her brain had caught up. She picked up the intake log and started comparing figures, slowly, carefully, not rushing it, because rushing it would mean making an error, and she couldn't afford an error. 12:15, she had enough. The discrepancy went back at least 4 months, based on what she could access from the ward's current filing system, probably further. The pattern was consistent, not random, not accidental, a systematic reduction of specific medication categories that followed a predictable cycle. Every 10 to 14 days, the same general volume each time. The same categories: antibiotics, respiratory support, cardiac maintenance drugs. Cheap end of essential. The stuff that kept people stable but didn't make headlines. The stuff that families ran out of money for first. She sat with that knowledge for a while. Then her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Miss Hartwell. A man's voice, not one she recognized. Smooth and unhurried in a way that immediately made her careful. Think it's time we talked. Who is this? My name is Gideon Pike, he said. I believe you've been paying me $140 a month for the past 16 months. Her stomach dropped. She knew the name. She knew it the way you know, the name of something you've been trying not to look at directly. Peripheral knowledge, pressure knowledge, the kind that sits at the edge of your awareness like a weight you'd adjusted to carrying. Meridian Solutions, LLC, the company that had bought her mother's medical debt. She'd never been able to find a person behind it. Only the company name and the bank account where she sent the payments. She'd tried twice to find out who owned it. Both times she'd hit walls. Gideon Pike. What do you want? She said. Her voice was flat. She was aware of the charge desk around her, the open space, And she stood up and walked to the far end of the hallway where there was a window alcove and no one nearby. I have a business proposition, he said. I'm not interested in propositions. You haven't heard it yet. It doesn't matter what it is. I think it might, he said, when you consider the context. A pause. Not for drama practical. The pause of someone organizing what they were about to say. You're 4 months behind on the principal payments. Not the minimums, the principal. At your current rate, the debt will outlast your working life. You know that. She said nothing. I'm prepared to forgive the entire balance, he said. Immediately. Clean discharge. The debt disappears. The hallway was very quiet. In exchange for what? She said. There are medications in Marlow County Hospital's supply system that I need moved through a distribution channel I've established. Quietly. The quantities are modest. The risk to you is minimal. And your Daddy paused again. Ceases to exist. You want me to steal medication from the hospital where I work, she said. I want you to facilitate a transfer, he said. The distinction matters legally. It doesn't matter to me, Miss Hartwell. His voice changed quality slightly. Not threatening exactly, but adjacent to threatening, the way a cloud is adjacent to rain. I want to be honest with you about the alternatives. If you decline, the account goes into formal collections. Given the size of the debt, there are legal remedies available to me that would significantly complicate your life. Your professional license, your guardianship of your brother. Her hand tightened on the phone. Evan, he said, not a question, just the name, just to show her that he had it. Don't, she said. I'm not threatening him, Gideon said. I'm being transparent. I prefer people to make informed decisions. The situation as it currently exists is unsustainable for you. I'm offering you a way out. What you do with that offer is entirely your choice. My choice, she said. Your choice. She looked out the window at the Baltimore night, the harbor lights in the distance, the darkness between them. She thought about the shelf in the supply room and the numbers that didn't match, and the medication crate on the hand truck and Agatha's folded hands on the blanket. No, she said. Silence. I see, Gideon said after a moment. His voice had gone very neutral. I want to make sure you've thought about. I said no. Her voice didn't shake. She was surprised by that. Don't call this number again. She hung up. She stood at the window for a long time. Long enough that her reflection became visible in the glass, her own face, looking back at her, pale and tired and absolutely terrified. She went back to work. The next 48 hours were the kind that left marks. Not visible ones. She went to work. She came home. She made Evan's breakfast. She paid the minimum on the electric bill with money she borrowed from herself from the next week's budget, but the kind that changed the quality of a person's attention. She found herself watching things more carefully. The hallway outside her apartment, the cars on Redmond Street, the faces of people who looked at her slightly too long. Nothing happened, which was almost worse. On Thursday morning, she went to the pharmacy 4 blocks away with the voucher from the envelope. The pharmacist processed it without any questions, handed her the 90-day supply of albuterol. And that was that. She stood on the sidewalk with a paper bag, on the sidewalk outside with the paper bag, and tried to feel something other than compromised. Couldn't. She went home. She put the medication in the cabinet, where Evan could reach it, and held the pressure, and about Cassian Rourke. She stood in the kitchen and thought about Cassian Rourke and the diner and the $19 and the envelope and the pamphlet with her name on it, Hartwell Children's Asthma Resource Fund. And she thought about the fact that she'd accepted the voucher because she'd had no choice. And she thought about Gideon Pike's voice saying your choice with the particular smoothness of someone who had removed all the real choices from the room first. She went back to the hospital Thursday night. She made a decision on the drive in. She was going to find Nora Kessler. Nora ran the night shift, the way a person runs something they've been running so long they've stopped thinking about the running and started just existing inside it automatically, quietly, with the efficient grace of deep habit. 58 had been at Marlow County for 22 years, and she had a way of moving through the ward that took up exactly the space she needed and no more. Celia had always respected her, had respected the efficiency, the consistency, the way Nora treated the patients on Ward 4 like people rather than caseloads. She'd thought, In the way you think things about colleagues, you don't examine too closely that Nora Kessler was exactly the kind of nurse the system was supposed to produce and rarely did. She found her in the medication prep room at 11:15. "I need 5 minutes," Celia said. Nora looked up from the tray she was arranging. Her expression was the professionally neutral one that nurses maintain by default, the one that reveals nothing. "I'm in the middle of the auxiliary supply room," Celia said quietly. "The inventory discrepancy. The crates that go out with the hand truck every 10 days or so." She paused. "I need 5 minutes." The professionally neutral expression didn't break. That was the thing. It stayed completely intact, and that told Celia more than a break would have. "Close the door," Nora said. Celia closed it. Nora set down the medication tray. She turned to face Celia with her arms at her sides, and for a moment the two of them just looked at each other across the small, bright room with its antiseptic smell and its fluorescent hum. Then something in Nora's posture changed, not collapsed. Exactly, but released. Particular release of something that had been held too long. "How much do you know?" Nora said. "Enough," Celia said. "How long?" 3 years. Nora's voice was completely flat. Not confessional, not emotional. Just factual. The way people get when they've been carrying something so heavy for so long that feeling about it has become a luxury they can afford. Started with one transfer. I told myself it was one time. "Who's running it?" A pause. "If I tell you that," Nora said, "there's no putting it back. There's nothing to put back. I already know about the records. I know the inventory numbers have been falsified. And I had a phone call 2 nights ago from a man named Gids Pike who wanted me to join in the operation." Something moved through Nora's face. Fast, controlled, but real. "He called you. He offered to discharge my mother's medical debt." Nora looked at her for a long second. "Your mother was a patient here?" 18 months ago, before she died." Celia held her gaze. Her medication kept disappearing. The medication kept disappearing. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Heavier. Nora looked away, and it was the first time in the conversation she hadn't met Celia's eyes, and that meant something. Celia was trained to read involuntary signals, had been reading them for 6 years, and what Nora's averted eyes meant was that she already knew, had already connected it, had probably known for a while that there were patients who had paid for what she'd helped move. "My daughter borrowed money from him," Nora said, finally, still not looking at her. 2 years before the hospital arrangement. She got in over her head. When she disappeared, Nora stopped, swallowed. She left behind a grandson, Marcus. He's 8 now. Gideon told me if I didn't cooperate, he'd have documentation sent to child services suggesting I was an unfit guardian. She paused. He had people watching Marcus at school. Celia's chest felt tight. "He watches children. He watches everything," Nora said. "That's how he works. He finds the thing you can't lose, and he stands next to it." She finally looked back at Celia. "What are you going to do?" Nora said. It was a genuine question. Not accusatory, not desperate. Genuine. One exhausted woman asking another what the next move was going to be, because the next move was going to determine what happened to both of them. "I don't know yet," Celia said honestly. It was the most honest thing she'd said out loud in weeks. She left Nora in the medication prep room and walked back to the charge desk and Sadie and sat down and looked at her hands again. Still steady, she was starting to distrust the steadiness. At 1:14 in the morning, she got another text from the unknown number. It wasn't Gideon this time. It was a photograph, a screenshot of a hospital access log. Her name, her badge number, a timestamp from 6 weeks ago, and a timestamp from 3 weeks ago, and a timestamp from last Tuesday. Supply room. Her master key access recorded by the system. Accompanied until the light changed. Accompanied by a single line. The authorities will receive this along with a summary of the discrepancies in the inventory for those dates. You have 72 hours to reconsider. She stared at the screen. He had framed her. Not perfectly. Not perfectly, she could see the gaps in it if she looked carefully, dates that didn't align with what she knew she'd been doing those nights, but well enough. Well enough that an investigation would be uncomfortable, protracted, damaging. Well enough that the hospital would place her on suspension pending review. Well enough that a family court, seeing a nurse under criminal investigation for pharmaceutical theft, might look twice at her guardianship of a 12-year-old. Evan. She put the phone face down on the desk. She sat there for 3 minutes, doing nothing except breathing and letting the shape of it settle around her, the trap. Its dimensions, the specific geometry of it, because ye'd chained. Because from watching her mother make bad decisions under pressure, that understanding the shape of a trap was the only way to find the part of it that wasn't solid. Then she picked up the phone and typed a number she'd been trying not to type for 4 days. It rang twice. Miss Hartwell. Silas Venn's voice was awake, alert, completely unsurprised by the hour. I was wondering when you'd call. I need to talk to him, she said. Not you, him. A brief pause. He's available now. I'll arrange it. There's a place on Harker Street, a diner, the one with the blue awning. Can you be there in 30 minutes? She was already reaching for her coat. Tell him I'll be there in 20, she said, and hung up before Silas could answer. She left the ward without clocking out, which she'd never done in 5 years. Not once. Not even on the nights she'd been sick, or the night her mother died. And that alone told her something about where she was now, past the line she'd drawn for herself. Past the version of the Saskatchewan where she could manage it quietly and keep her hands clean and protect everyone she needed to protect without letting the darkness that surrounded Cassian Rourke into the space where she and Evan lived. She walked to her car. The November air hit her face like cold water. She got in and drove, and behind her the hospital's lights stayed on the way they always did, constant, indifferent, shining for everyone and no one. And somewhere in the building, Agatha Bell was probably still awake, hands folded, watching the door, and Nora Kessler was standing in the medication prep room with the tray she hadn't finished, and the supply room was locked, and the numbers on the tag still said one thing, and the shelves still said another, and none of it was going to stay quiet much longer. Celia drove. The city moved around her in its nighttime configuration, thin traffic, distant sirens, the harbor somewhere to the east, throwing its cold light up into a sky that was cloudless for once and full of stars that nobody in Baltimore ever looked at. She wasn't going back from this. She knew that. She pressed the accelerator and went to meet the man she'd given her last $19 to. The man who frightened people she'd never met. The man she'd told she hadn't helped for his sake, and she drove through the cold Baltimore night toward whatever came next, because there was nothing behind her anymore worth turning around for. The diner on Harker Street had a blue awning and a broken heater and 4 tables, and Cassian Rourke was already sitting at the one in the back when Celia walked in 17 minutes after hanging up on Silas. He was alone. No coat this time, a dark jacket, open at the collar, a cup of coffee in front of him that he wasn't drinking. He looked up when she came through the door. He looked up when she through the door, and his expression did the thing she'd noticed the first time. It registered her arrival and then went neutral, carefully neutral, the way a person goes neutral when they've taught themselves that showing what they're thinking is a liability. She sat down across from him without taking off her coat. Someone is framing me, she said. She put the phone on the table between them, screen up, the photograph still open. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he looked at her. Tell me everything, he said. So she did. She told it the way she told things when she was doing intake at the hospital, sequentially, without editorializing, the facts in order with the emotional content stripped out, because the emotional didn't help anyone make better decisions. She told him about the supply room and the inventory discrepancy. She told him about Agatha. She told him about Agatha. She told him about Gideon Pike's call and the proposition and the refusal. She told him about Nora and the 3 years, and the grandson named Marcus and the daughter who had disappeared. She told him about the photograph and the 72-hour deadline. When she finished, the diner was quiet. A cook, somewhere in the back, moved something metal against something else metal. The front door had a draft that came through at irregular intervals, cold and carrying the smell of the harbor. Cassian hadn't moved. His hands were flat on the table. His eyes were on her face. You told Nora you knew, he said. Yes. Before you called Silas. Yes, that was a risk. I know. Nora could have called Pike directly. She didn't. You couldn't have known she wouldn't. Celia looked at him. Could see it in her face. She's not protecting him. Trapped by him. There's a difference. Something moved in his expression Not agreement, debt, exactly, but recognition. Picked up his coffee cup and set it down again, without drinking. Gideon Pike, he said. The name in his mouth had a specific quality, not anger, something more controlled than anger. The way a person says the name of something they've known about for a while and have been waiting to have a reason to address. You know him, she said. I know of him. He paused. He operates in spaces I don't operate in. Debt collection, pharmaceutical distribution, some import arrangements. He's always stayed away from the harbor. But Cassian's jaw tightened slightly. But I know what he does to people who owe him. I've seen the aftermath. He bought my mother's medical debt, Celia said, while she was dying. Someone sold it to him, and he's been holding it over me since before I even knew his name. How much? She told him. He didn't react to the number the way most people reacted to it, with the small involuntary recoil that acknowledged its weight. He just absorbed it, filed it, the medication theft. He said, How long has it been running? Based on what I can access, at least 3 years. Probably further. And your mother was a patient here 3 years ago. She was a patient for about 8 months before she died. Her medications kept running short. The doctors told us it was a supply issue, a national shortage on one of the cardiac drugs. We believed them. She stopped, started again. I believed them. Cassian looked at her steadily. I need you to say the thing you're not saying, he said. Strange thing to ask. It was also exactly right. She looked at the table. I think the medication my mother needed may have been in those crates, she said. I think she may have been dying in a bed on Ward 4 while the drugs that could have stabilized her were being loaded onto a hand truck. She looked up, and I think Gideon Pike profited from that. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Okay, Cassian said quietly. Just that. Just the one word. But the way he said it, low, settled, final, changed the temperature of the conversation entirely. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't sympathy. So it was the sound of a decision being made. I need to find his ledger, Cassian said. Everything Pike runs, he documents. He has to. It's too complex to run on trust alone. Somewhere there are records, names of buyers, delivery routes, the hospital contacts, the debt portfolios of it. How do you know that? Because I run an operation that's too complex to keep in my head, he said simply. Everyone does. The question is where he keeps it. And if you find it, then Gideon Pike stops being a problem. I need to know what that means. He met her eyes. It means his operation collapses. His leverage over you, and Nora and everyone else he's been holding disappears.
This is impure.
Faces consequences through channels that will put him somewhere he can't reach any of you from. You're talking about the police, among others. Studied his face. He let her look, which itself was a kind of answer. He wasn't hiding from the scrutiny. Why? She said. Not the debt from the diner. Not $19. That doesn't explain this. His hands moved on the table. Small shift, almost imperceptible. Hospitals are untouchable territory, he said. Children are untouchable. Medication is untouchable. Anyone who moves against those things. He stopped. That's not a business principle. It's a personal one. She waited. He looked at the table for a moment, and she saw something that she'd never have expected to see in that face, a kind of unguarded distance. A person looking at something only they could see. There was a nurse, he said, when I was 8. He told her. He told it the same way she had stripped of decoration. Just the facts in sequence. The sickness, the mother who couldn't pay, the medication that appeared without explanation, the fever that broke, the unnamed woman on the night shift who was gone before he was well enough to find her. Celia listened without moving. I've been looking for a way to pay that back my entire life, he said. I haven't always looked in the right places. He paused. This one is right. She held his gaze for a long moment. All right, she said. What happened next happened fast, or seemed to, in retrospect, though in reality, it was 3 days of careful, methodical work that Cassian's people conducted with the particular quiet efficiency of people who had been doing this kind of thing for a long time. Silas Venn ran the intelligence side. He mapped Gideon Pike's known associates, his registered businesses, the physical locations associated with each. He found the delivery network a loose arrangement of contracted couriers who moved pharmaceutical product through a warehouse on the eastern edge of the city, staging it for distribution to buyers. Silas hadn't yet fully identified. Celia went back to work. This was Cassian's instruction. delivered at the end of the diner meeting, in a tone that didn't leave room for argument. Go back. Normal. Don't confront Nora again. Don't touch the supply room. Don't do anything that signals you've moved. She went back. She acted normal, did her rounds and wrote her notes, and answered questions, and talked to Agatha about her grandchildren, and said nothing, not a word, not a look that acknowledged anything had changed. It was the hardest thing she'd done in a long time. Harder than the financial triage of the past year. Harder than the conversations with the debt collection number that she'd been letting go to voicemail for months. Harder, in a specific and particular way that she hadn't expected, than the night her mother died, because that night she had been allowed to feel what she felt, and this required the complete suppression of what she felt in the service of a plan that depended on nobody seeing it, kept going. On the second day, Agatha called her over during afternoon rounds. The delivery happened again last night, Agatha said, without preamble. Celia kept her face neutral. Okay, there was someone else with them this time, not the usual young man. What did he look like? Older, 50, maybe, very still. He stood in the hallway while the other one went inside. Agatha paused. He was watching the ward, not the room, the ward. Celia's pulse moved. How long was he there? Long enough, Agatha said. He looked at your station twice. She thanked Agatha and walked back to the charge desk at a pace she kept deliberately normal. And she sat down and thought about what it meant that Gideon Pike had sent someone to watch her station specifically, and the answer she arrived at was that he already knew she'd refused, and he was checking to see if she'd done anything about it, which meant his 72-hour clock was running. Texted Silas. He had someone in the hospital last night watching me. He's escalating. Silas responded in under a minute. Cassian knows. Stay in position. She put the phone away. At 2 a.m, she was charting at the desk when Nora appeared beside her. Not approaching, from the hallway, already there. Suddenly, as if she'd materialized from the particular shadows that collected in the corners of the night ward. I need to tell you something, Nora said. Her voice was different. The flat exhaustion was still there, but something else had cut through it. Something raw and frightened that Nora was working hard to keep control and not quite managing. Celia looked around. Nobody near. Talk. I have records, Nora said. I've been keeping them. Since the beginning. She looked at her own hands, then back at Celia. Every transfer. The dates, the quantities, the delivery names. I wrote everything down because she stopped. Started again. Because I couldn't stop what was happening. But I needed to know that there was evidence. That if something happened to me, there would be a record. Celia stared at her. You've had documentation for 3 years. Yes. Where? Off-site. A storage unit on Fells Point. Under my maiden name. Nora's jaw was tight. I have delivery manifests going back to the beginning of the arrangement. Names of buyers, payment records, and she stopped again. And what? Nora looked at her directly. Her eyes were dry but barely. Patient records, a cross-reference I put together myself. Patients on Ward 4 whose medication supplies were significantly reduced during active transfer periods. She paused. Including the cardiac patients, the air in the ward felt very still. My mother, Celia said. Nora held her gaze. I don't know for certain. Connection isn't proven in the records. But the correlation, she stopped. Margaret Hartwell, admitted 14 months before she died. Cardiac maintenance medication. I have 3 documented transfer events during her stay where the specific medication she was prescribed were among the items moved. Celia heard the words. She heard them correctly, understood their meaning, processed their implications. And then something happened in her chest. And then something happened in her chest that she didn't have a clean name for, not anger, not grief. Something that was both of those things compressed into a single point of absolute cold certainty. Her mother had lain in a bed on this ward. Her mother had been told the medications were unavailable. The medications had been on a hand truck going out the service entrance. How complete are the records? She asked. Her voice was steady. She was going to have to think about that later. Complete enough, Nora said. Combined with what Cassian Rourke's people can get from the distribution end mines. Celia went very still. You know about Cassian. Something crossed Nora's face. I've known about Cassian Rourke for 2 years. She said it quietly, without apology. When I realized what Gideon was, I looked for everyone he might be in conflict with. Rourke's name came up. She paused. I didn't contact him because I didn't know how, and because I was afraid of what he might want in return. He doesn't want anything in return, Celia said. Nora looked at her for a long moment. You're sure of that? No, Celia said honestly. But I'm sure enough. Nora nodded, a slow, exhausted nod. The storage unit key is in my locker. If something happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you. Celia, Nora's voice was firm. If something happens to me, the key is taped to the inside of my locker door. The unit address is written on the back of a pharmacy receipt in my coat pocket. She paused. Marcus's school is Eastfield Elementary. He gets out at 3:15. If I don't come, stop, Celia said. I need you to hear this. I heard it. Celia looked at her. I heard all of it. Now I need you to go home at the end of your shift and lock your door, and not go anywhere Gideon Pike's people might be expecting you to go. Can you do that? Nora straightened. A small movement. Yes, then do that. Nora walked away down the hall. Celia watched her go, and then turned back to her chart and sat there for exactly 1 minute, just breathing, just letting the shape of what she now knew settle into her understanding of everything that had come before it. Her mother's last months, the bills, the apologies from doctors about supply issues, particular helpless rage she'd felt and suppressed and carried forward as pure forward motion, because there was nothing else to do with it. Now there was something to do with it. She picked up her phone and called Cassian directly, not Silas. Cassian, and when he answered on the second ring, she said, Nora has documentation. 3 years of records. Everything. Where do we go from here? A brief silence. Can you get the records tonight? I can get the key tonight. Then get the key. Silas will meet you at Fells Point at end of your shift. He paused. Celia, this is going to move fast now. Once we have the records, we move. For that, she thought about her mother. She thought about Evan. She thought about Agatha's folded hands and Nora's face and the inventory numbers that lied in the crate on the hand truck. Yes, she said. She hung up. At 4:47 in the morning, with 40 minutes left in her shift, her phone rang again. Unknown number. Not Gideon's usual pattern he'd called before the shift. Never during. She answered anyway, because not answering was information she couldn't afford to give him. Miss Hartwell. His voice was different this time. The smooth, unhurried quality was still there, but compressed over something harder. I've extended you more patience than I extend most people. I want you to understand that. Your 72 hours aren't up, she said. No, but I've received information that suggests you've been busy during them, in ways that concern me. Her hand tightened on the phone. I don't know what you mean, she said. I think you do. A pause. I'm going to say something to you, and I want you to hear it carefully. Your brother is at school today, Eastfield Elementary. He gets out at 3:15. Everything in her went cold. Nora had said those words 20 minutes ago, in this building, in the ward hallway at 2 in the morning, with no one nearby. What did you just say? She said. Her voice had dropped to almost nothing. I said your brother attends Eastfield Elementary. He gets out at, I heard you. She was standing. She didn't remember standing. How do you know that? Miss Hartwell, Gideon said. Very carefully. I've had eyes in that hospital since before you started your shift tonight. I know about your conversation with Nora Kessler. I know about the storage unit on Fells Point. And I know about your communication with Cassian Rourke. The floor felt wrong. The ward felt wrong. The lights were the same lights and the smell was the same smell and the sounds were the same sounds. But something in the architecture of the situation had just shifted violently, and she was standing in a different building than the one she'd been in 30 seconds ago. Someone in this hospital was reporting to Gideon Pike. Not Nora, not after that conversation. Someone else. Someone who had been watching and listening and reporting for long enough that Gideon knew about Cassian, knew about the storage unit, knew about a private conversation held in a night ward hallway at 2 in the morning. You have 24 hours, Gideon said. His voice had gone very flat, very final. Not for cooperation. That offer is closed. 24 hours to deliver Cassian Rourke's location and any documentation Nora Kessler has compiled. If I don't have both by 6 tomorrow morning. He stopped. Evan has asthma. Children with asthma can have episodes without warning. People around them aren't always prepared. She couldn't speak. I'm not a monster, Gideon said. I don't want to hurt a child. I want you to understand that clearly. I want you to understand that clearly. But I need you to understand equally clearly that I will protect my operation by whatever means are necessary. Your choices created this situation. Your choices can resolve it. He hung up. She stood at the charge desk for 4 seconds. 5, 6. Then she moved. She moved fast. Down the hall to the medication prep room. Door open. Light on. She went in and stood over the sink and turned the cold water on and pressed both hands against the basin and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way she coached patients through panic. In, out. The water ran cold over her wrists. In, out. Evan was home. It was 4:50 in the morning. He was home and asleep, and the inhaler was in the bathroom cabinet, and whoever Gideon had watching him wasn't going to move until morning because Gideon had just said 24 hours, and that meant she had time. Time was the only thing she had. She pulled out her phone with wet hands and called Cassian. He answered before the first ring finished. He has someone inside the hospital, she said. He knows about Nora's records. He knows about you. He threatened Evan. Her voice finally cracked, just slightly, on the last word, the one crack she allowed herself before she pulled it back. He wants me to give him your location and Nora's documentation by 6 tomorrow morning. Silence on Cassian's end. 2 seconds. 3. Where is Evan right now? He said. Home. Asleep. I'm going to send someone to your apartment building. They won't go inside. They'll be in the street. Evan will not be touched. His voice was absolute. Not reassuring. Absolute, the kind people do when they're trying to calm you down. Factual, absolute. Do you understand? Yes. The informant in the hospital did anything happen tonight that narrowed who it could be. She thought back fast. Who had been in the ward? Who had been near the hallway when she and Nora spoke? Charge desk, the medication prep room, the angles. And then she stopped. She went very still because she thought about the medication prep room door. Closed, she'd thought. She'd told Nora to close it, and Nora had closed it, and she'd heard it close. But there was a window in that door, a small one. Standard hospital safety glass, the kind that let you see into the room without entering it. And the window had a blind on the inside that was usually down. She hadn't checked if the blind was down. She hadn't looked. Thought about who had been in the hallway between 2 and 2:15. Who had a reason to be there. Who she'd seen and not seen, and categorized as ordinary, and moved past. A name arrived in her mind like a stone dropping into still water. She had passed him in the hallway at 2:08. He'd been coming from the direction of the medication prep room with the clipboard. She hadn't thought twice, because he was always somewhere in the ward at that hour. He worked nights, had for years, moved through the floor with the invisible familiarity of someone who belonged there. Dr. Timothy Rand. Resident physician, Ward 4, 3 years. The same 3 years the transfers had been running. I know who it is, she said. Her voice was different now. Colder than she expected it to be. Harder. She barely recognized it. Then don't go near him, Cassian said immediately. Don't let him know you've made the connection. Go finish your shift. Collect the key from Nora's locker. And meet Silas at Fells Point exactly as planned. Everything else I handle. And Evan is already handled. I made a call 4 minutes ago. She leaned against the sink. Cold water was running, still running. She reached over and turned it off. Outside the prep room window, the ward was quiet. The lights hummed their constant fluorescent hum. Somewhere down the hall, a patient's monitor beeped its regular rhythm, steady and unconcerned, the sound of a body still working against odds it didn't know about. Thought about who she'd been 6 hours ago. The nurse who'd walked into a diner and given away her last $19 on instinct and hadn't second-guessed it for a moment. That woman felt very far away. The woman standing at the sink now had a name in her head and a threat against her brother and an informant in the hallway and the cold, certain knowledge that the people she was up against had been watching her long enough to know every corner of her life, her brother's school, her mother's ward number, the private words spoken in a closed room in the middle of the night. She straightened up. She dried her hands. She went back to work. And she did not look at Timothy Rand for the remaining 37 minutes of her shift. Not once. Not even a pressure until the light changed. At the desk at 5:15 and said, "Good morning," in the ordinary way he always said it. and she said good morning back in the ordinary way. She always said it, and smiled the ordinary smile, and felt something harden inside her that she suspected was not going to soften again for a very long time. She finished her shift. She clocked out at 6:02. She walked to Nora's locker. Nora had left already end of shift, 40 minutes before Celia, the way it always worked on Ward 4. The locker was closed but not locked, which meant Nora had anticipated this, had left it open deliberately, had trusted her with that much. Celia opened it and felt along the inside of the door, without turning on the overhead light, using the ambient glow from the hallway, keeping her movements ordinary in case anyone was watching. The key was there, taped exactly where Nora said, a small brass key on a paper tag that had a unit number written on it in ballpoint pen. She peeled it off the door carefully, folded it into her palm, closed the locker, and walked out of the locker room without looking back. Timothy Rand was at the charge desk when she passed it. He looked up, said nothing. She said nothing. Their eyes met for maybe a second and a half, and in that second and a half, she understood something she hadn't understood before. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't watching her with the specific alertness of someone who suspected they'd been identified. He was completely relaxed, finishing his chart, his pen moving in its ordinary way across the page, which meant one of two things. Either he didn't know she'd made the connection, or he knew, and it didn't matter to him, because Gideon had already set something in motion, Snan, that made her knowledge irrelevant. She went with the first option because the second one was the kind of thought that would stop her legs working if she let it fully form. She walked out of the hospital into the early morning. Sky was the particular gray of a November dawn that wasn't warm up, or flat and permanent, the kind of gray that settled in for the day. Her breath came out in small clouds. She crossed the parking lot to her car, got in, sat for exactly 4 seconds, then drove. Silas was waiting at Fells Point. He was in a black SUV parked on the street outside a storage facility that had the closed, industrial look of a place that existed to hold things people didn't want to think about. He got out when she pulled up, and he looked at her face and said nothing about what he saw there. Key, he said. She handed it to him. He looked at the tag. Unit 41. Come on. The facility manager was not present at 6 in the morning, but the gate had a keypad code. And Silas had the code, and Celia didn't ask how. They found Unit 41 in the second row. The key turned. The door rolled up on a space the size of a large closet containing 2 plastic storage bins and a filing box. Silas opened the bins. First one held personal items, photos, documents, the kind of thing a person stored when they needed to protect something from a situation they weren't sure would stay controlled. The second held what they'd come for, files, organized files, labeled in Nora's small, precise handwriting. Dates going back 3 years and 4 months. Delivery records, each one annotated with quantities and categories. Handwritten copies of correspondence. Not originals, copies in Nora's hand, which meant she'd transcribed things she'd seen and couldn't remove from wherever they'd been. A separate folder labeled in different handwriting than everything else. A handwriting that was smaller and less controlled, that Celia recognized as her own when she was very tired. She didn't recognize the folder. She'd never seen it before. She picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single photograph and 3 pages of typed documentation. The photograph was of a man she didn't recognize. 50s, heavy-set, photographed from a distance, through what appeared to be a car window, walking into a building she didn't recognize. The documentation was a patient complaint record, dated 14 months ago. Patient name was Margaret Hartwell. The complaint was filed by a staff member who had noted repeated discrepancies in the patient's medication administration records and requested an internal review. Staff member who filed the complaint was listed as N. Kessler N. Celia read it again. Then she read it a third time. Nora had filed a complaint about her mother's medications 14 months ago, and the complaint had been, she turned to the second page, reviewed, noted, and dismissed by the hospital's internal audit committee, which had determined the discrepancies attributable to documented national supply shortages. The man who signed the dismissal letter was the head of the audit committee. His name was Dr. Timothy Rand. She stood in the storage unit, holding The 3 pages and the photograph, and she felt the world rearrange itself around her in a way that was completely silent and completely devastating, the specific rearrangement that happens when you discover that something you thought was random was deliberate, that something you thought was random was deliberate, that something you thought was bureaucratic negligence was designed, that someone made a decision about your mother's life from a chair in a committee room and signed their name to it. Celia. Silas's voice was careful. She looked up. He was watching her with the particular attention of someone who could see that the person in front of them was holding something together by force of will and trying to calculate how much more pressure it could take. Take everything, she said. All of it. He took everything. They were back in the SUV by 7:15. Silas drove. Celia sat in the passenger seat with the filing box on her lap and looked out the window at the city coming alive around them. The early traffic, the coffee shops opening, the ordinary machinery of an ordinary morning. And she thought about how many ordinary mornings she'd had that were built on a foundation she hadn't known was rotten. He was on the audit committee, she said. I know, Silas said. He'd read the documents while she stood there. Cassian knows too. I sent photographs of the pages to him while you were still reading. How long has Rand been working for Gideon? We think from the beginning. He's the inside medical authority. He's the inside medical authority. When questions get raised, supply discrepancies, he's the one who reviews the complaints and determines whether they go anywhere. He paused. He's killed at least 4 internal reviews in 3 years. She absorbed that. Where are we going? She said. Cassian's. He glanced at her. He wants everyone in the same place before he makes a move. You, Nora. The documentation. Nora doesn't know the meeting location. She does now. He called her directly at 6:30. Celia looked at him. He had her number. He's had it for a while. She didn't ask more about that. She turned back to the window and watched Baltimore move past her. And she held the filing box steady on her lap against the motion of the car. Cassian's location was a warehouse near the southern waterfront, not the eastern harbor where his operational territory lay, but a secondary space that Silas described as a working facility, and that turned out to be a large, climate-controlled building with 3 vehicles inside and a section in the rear that had been arranged with a long table, chairs, and specific functional severity of a place where decisions got made. Nora was already there when they arrived. She was sitting at the table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, and she looked up when Celia came in with the expression of someone who has already done their worst hour of the morning and come out the other side of it into a kind of exhausted clarity. She looked at Celia's face. You found the folder, she said. Why didn't you tell me? Celia said. About the complaint. Because I found Rand's involvement 3 weeks ago, and I didn't know yet what you were going to do. I didn't know if you were going to try to handle it internally. Go to hospital administration. Go to the police. I didn't know if telling you about Rand before you were committed to a course of action would push you into something that would get you killed. She paused. I was protecting you. My mother needed protecting, Celia said. I know that. Nora's voice didn't break. I know. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't find it sooner. I'm sorry I didn't push harder when the review came back closed. I'm sorry that I was so afraid of what Gideon would do to Marcus that I let it. She stopped, looked at her hands around the mug. I let it sit. I kept records, and I let it sit. And your mother, Celia said. Nora looked up. Not right now, Celia said. Not cruel. Just final. Later. Right now, I need you to be the person who knows where all the bodies are buried in those records. Can you do that? A beat. Then Nora nodded. Once solid. Cassian came in from the far end of the space at 7:51. He was followed by Silas and a man Celia hadn't seen before, compact, watchful, who positioned himself near the entrance and stayed there without being asked. Cassian looked at the filing box on the table, then at Celia, then at Nora. Gideon knows we have the records, he said. Not a question. He knows about the storage unit, Celia said. He may not know we've already accessed it. He'll know by now. He had eyes on the facility. He sat down at the head of the table and pulled the filing box toward him. Here's where we are. Silas has identified the warehouse. Gideon uses for staging distribution a facility on Kemper Road, eastern edge of the city. The ledger is almost certainly there. Gideon won't keep it in a location he doesn't control physically, and the warehouse is the center of his distribution operation. He opened the box and looked at the top folder. What's in here is substantial, but without the ledger, without the buyer names, the payment trails, the complete distribution network, we can dismantle the hospital piece and leave the rest of his operation intact. Then we need the ledger, Silas said. Yes. Cassian looked at Celia. Your 72-hour window has been void since Gideon made the threat against Evan this morning. He accelerated his own timeline. That means ours accelerates too. He paused. Evan is secure. I have 2 people outside your building. He is not going anywhere without one of them present. He doesn't know that, Celia said. He'll go to school. My people will take him to school. He won't know they're there. She looked at him for a moment. You thought of that. I thought of it, he said. She didn't say thank you. He didn't seem to expect it. Rand, she said. He's still at the hospital. He's going to know. The records are gone and he's going to report to Gideon. Rand left the hospital at 6:40 this morning, Silas said. He clocked out 40 minutes early. He hasn't gone home. His car was tracked to a parking structure near Kemper Road. Table went quiet. He's at the warehouse, Cassian said. Which means Gideon knows everything, Nora said. Yes. And he's moving now. Yes. Cassian looked at Silas. Something passed between them that wasn't visible in their faces, just in the slight adjustment of posture, the small mutual acknowledgement of 2 people who had run this calculation before in other configurations and knew what the output meant. We go tonight, Cassian said. What followed was the longest day Celia had been through since her mother died. She wasn't permitted to go home, Cassian's instruction. Delivered without apology, because her apartment was a location Gideon knew and could watch. She stayed at the warehouse. She slept for 2 hours on a cot someone produced from somewhere, and she didn't ask about. She ate something she didn't taste. She ate something she didn't taste. She sat with Nora for an hour going through the records systematically, building a chronological narrative from the files that a prosecutor could follow without ambiguity. At 2 in the afternoon, Silas came in with news that changed the shape of the evening. Gideon had moved the ledger. Not from the Kemper Road warehouse. The warehouse was still operational, still active. But intelligence from one of Cassian's people inside Gideon's distribution network indicated that the physical ledger, the master document, the one Gideon kept in a locked case and moved personally, had been relocated to a secondary location. An apartment on Fulton Street. The apartment was registered to a name that didn't match any of Gideon's known associates, which meant a clean identity. Someone new, someone they hadn't mapped. He's running, Silas said. He's not running, Cassian said. He's consolidating. He's pulling his most sensitive asset to a location he considers uncompromised. That means he doesn't know we have eyes on the network, Silas said. It means he thinks he's still ahead of us. Cassian looked at the map Silas had spread on the table, which means we have a window, a narrow one. The plan that emerged from the next 4 hours of conversation was not the kind of plan that had a name or a diagram. It was thus the kind that existed in the specific understanding between people who trusted each other's execution and moved accordingly. Silas took 3 men to Fulton Street. Cassian handled the Kemper Road end with 2 more. The legal documentation, the records, the cross-referenced patient files, the complaint records. Everything Nora had compiled was packaged and given to a lawyer whose name Cassian provided, a woman whose card said family and criminal law, and who arrived at the warehouse at 4:30 looking as though she'd been called at 4:30 before, and was entirely undisturbed by it. Celia watched her review the documents. The lawyer's name was Patricia Moen. She read quickly and made notes with a mechanical pencil in the margins of her own legal pad, never in the documents themselves. When she finished, she looked up at Cassian. This is enough for a preliminary injunction on the hospital operations. And a solid fraud case, she said. For the criminal pharmaceutical distribution piece, you need the distribution records, buyer names, payment structures. The ledger, Cassian said, when you have it tonight. Patricia Moen closed her legal pad. I'll be available, she said, and left. At 6 in the evening, Celia's phone rang. Gideon Pike. She looked at Cassian. He nodded. She answered. Your 24 hours are running out, Gideon said. His voice had the same controlled smoothness, but something underneath it was different, or tighter, more compressed. The sound of a man who had been moving pieces all day and was closing toward an end game. "I know," she said. "Have you reconsidered?" "No." Pause. "Then I want you to understand that what happens next is a result of your choices." "I understand that," she said. "I want you to understand the same thing." Silence. "What does that mean?" he said. She looked at Cassian across the table. His face was completely still, watching her, and there was something only in his eyes that she could only describe later in a different conversation to a different person as steadiness of the absolute kind that didn't come from certainty, that things would go right, but from having made complete peace with the cost of doing what was right anyway. "It means we're done talking," she said, and hung up. Gideon called back twice. She didn't answer. At 8:15, Silas sent a message. "Fulton Street is done. We have the ledger, physically intact." Cassian looked at the message. Then he stood up and put on his coat. "Stay here," he said to Celia. "No," she said. He looked at her. "He threatened my brother," she said. "He watched my mother die. He put a man inside the hospital where I worked to make sure the people stealing medication never got caught. I am not staying here." Cassian held her gaze for a long moment. "You stay with Silas," he said. "You don't go inside anything. You are not." He paused, choosing it carefully. "You are not expendable, and this operation depends on the witnesses surviving intact." "Agreed," she said. They drove to Celia's apartment building first, not because the plan required it, but because Celia needed to see with her own eyes that the two people Cassian had stationed outside were real and present and positioned correctly, and he allowed this without discussion. The two men were there, one in a car across the street, one at the corner with a coffee, both visible only if you knew to look. The lights in Celia's apartment were off. Evan was spending the night at a school friend's, arranged by Cassian's people through a call from Celia's phone to the friend's mother at noon, made to sound completely ordinary because it was Celia's voice, and it was completely ordinary. She sat in the car and looked at the building for 30 seconds. Then she said, "Okay, let's go." Gideon Pike arrived at Celia's apartment at 9:47, with two men whose function was obvious from the way they carried themselves weight forward, hands loose at their sides. Specific physical vocabulary of people whose job was to make other people feel what they were going to feel before they were told to feel it. He didn't knock for 30 seconds. He knocked for 4. The door opened. Celia stood in the doorway. She was alone. Gideon looked at her face, at the apartment behind her, at the absence of the fear he'd been expecting, and something shifted in his expression. Fast, controlled. The recalculation of a man who was very good at recalculating. "Where's the boy?" he said. "Somewhere you're not," she said. His jaw tightened. "Step aside." "No." The man on Gideon's left moved forward, and from the shadow at the end of the hallway, a voice said, with absolute quiet, "I wouldn't." Silas Venn stepped into the light. He had 2 men with him. The 2 men Gideon had brought looked at Silas's 2 men and did the arithmetic that armed people do in hallways, the rapid unconscious calculation of weight and position and probability, and arrived at the correct answer, which was that the arithmetic didn't favor them. They stepped back. Gideon didn't step back. He looked down the hallway at Silas, then past Silas at the man who had appeared behind him, unhurried, hands in his coat pockets, pale gray eyes taking in the hallway with the calm of someone who had arrived exactly when he intended to. Cassian Rourke. The 2 men looked at each other across 12 feet of hallway carpet and bad overhead lighting, and the thing that passed between them was not anger exactly, and not fear exactly, but the specific recognition of 2 people who have been moving towards each other for a long time and have finally run out of distance. "It's over," Cassian said. His voice was absolutely level. "The ledger is with my lawyer. The hospital records are with my lawyer. Patricia Moen filed the preliminary return documentation with the district attorney's office at 8:45 tonight. Nora Kessler's testimony is on record. Timothy Rand was detained at 7 this morning." He paused. "Your operation is finished. Your leverage over anyone in this building is finished. And your ability to threaten a 12-year-old boy or a night shift nurse or a 73-year-old cardiac patient is finished. Gideon's face had gone very still. "You don't want to do this through the police," he said. "Know what kind of exposure that creates for—" "I know exactly what it creates," Cassian said. "I made that calculation before I started. I'm comfortable with the outcome. You'll face questions. I've faced questions before." He looked at Gideon with an expression that contained nothing, not satisfaction, not anger, nothing that would give anyone in that hallway something to hold on to. "What you did in that hospital, with those medications, with those patients." He stopped. Just for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes that he shut down immediately. "That's not business. That's not leverage. That's not a transaction. What you did killed people. And the fact that it took this long for someone to stop you doesn't mean it wasn't going to happen eventually." Gideon looked at him for a long second. Then he looked at Celia. She was still standing in the doorway. She hadn't moved. Her arms were at her sides, and her face was the face she wore on the ward when something difficult was happening to someone. And she needed to be the stable thing in the room, not cold, not hard, just completely present and absolutely unmoved. "You," he said. "You started this. You started this," she said. 3 years ago, in a supply room in a hospital where my mother was a patient." She held his gaze. "I'm finishing it." Gideon's jaw worked once. The smoothness finally cracked. Just at the surface, just enough to see what was underneath it, not fear, but something adjacent to it. The specific cold recognition of a man who has built an entire architecture of control and is watching it come apart piece by piece and can't stop it because the pieces were never as solid as he believed. He looked at his 2 men. They had already moved away from him. The hallway was very quiet. Then the sound of footsteps on the stairwell measured, official, specific cadence of people who had been waiting for a signal. The signal from the Baltimore police and 2 detectives from the Baltimore police appeared at the top of the stairs with their badges visible and their hands ready but not raised. Professional posture of people who were expecting compliance and would manage non-compliance if it came to that. Gideon looked at Cassian. Cassian looked back at him. "I told you," Cassian said quietly. "The debt is finished. Threats are finished." He paused. "Everything is finished." The detectives moved forward, and Gideon Pike, who had made a career of watching other people lose their options while keeping his own intact, and stood in a hallway on Redmond Street on a November night and ran out of moves for the first time in his life, and the look on his face in the moment he understood, the precise moment which Celia watched from the doorway and did not look away from, was not the look she'd expected. It wasn't rage, it wasn't collapse. It was just the look of someone who had finally arrived at the thing they'd been moving toward, all along without knowing it, the terminus of a particular kind of life, and found it to be exactly as small and as cold as it deserved to be. The detective said his name, read him the words. Gideon's hands came together behind his back, with a sound that was very quiet in the hallway and very final. Celia leaned against the doorframe and watched them walk him to the stairwell. She breathed in. She breathed out. The hallway was empty now except for Cassian and Silas and the 2 men at the far end, and Cassian was looking at her from 12 feet away with those pale gray eyes, and his hands still in his coat pockets. And the look on his face was the same one she'd seen in the diner, the recalculating look. The one that meant she'd presented him with a variable he didn't know what to do with yet. "Worked," she said, partly to him, partly just to say it out loud. "It worked," he said. She looked at the stairwell where Gideon had disappeared. "Is it actually over?" she said. "All of it? The buyers? The distribution? All of me?" "The ledger has 47 names," Cassian said. "Buyers, contacts, facilitators. Moen has all 47. The DA's office has all 47. He paused. "It's over." She nodded, once. Her throat was tight, in a way she hadn't given herself permission to acknowledge until this exact second. "Evan," she said. "Safe. He'll be home tomorrow morning." She nodded again. She looked at Cassian one more time, this man she'd given $19 to in a diner. 7 days ago, this man who moved through the criminal world like weather. This man who had a memory of an unnamed nurse that had traveled with him for 40 years and finally found its way back. And she didn't say anything because there wasn't anything adequate, and he seemed to understand that because he nodded at her the same way. He'd nodded at her the first night. Small, quiet, final. She went inside and closed the door. She sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet because the chair was too far, and she didn't trust her legs all the way to the chair. And she put her face in her hands and stayed there for a long time in the dark quiet of the apartment while the city moved on outside the window and the radiator, and somewhere in the distance the harbor caught the last of the November light and held it. She stayed on the kitchen floor for a long time, not because she couldn't get up, could have gotten up. Her legs worked fine, her back was fine, her body had held together through worse than one night on linoleum. Stayed because getting up meant moving into whatever came next, and she needed one more minute inside, before the last few seconds of the version of her life that was still in the middle of something before she stepped into the after, which she hadn't looked at yet, because looking at it required acknowledging that it existed, and acknowledging that it existed required acknowledging that it was over, and she wasn't sure she trusted that yet. The radiator ticked. A car passed on Redmond Street below. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. She lifted her face from her hands. Kitchen. Lost. The kitchen was dark except for the transient door into the city, coming through the window above the sink, the particular color of Baltimore at night, which she'd been seeing her entire life and had never tried to name. She sat in it for another minute. Then she put her palms flat on the floor and pushed herself up and stood in her kitchen in the dark and looked at the counter where the third notice electric bill had been face down for a week. She turned it face up. She looked at the number on it for a long time. Then she found her phone and called Evan. He answered on the third ring, groggy, the specific, confused voice of a 12-year-old pulled out of sleep. "Cece? Yeah," she said. "It's me. What time is it?" "Late. Go back to sleep." "Is something wrong?" She looked at the electric bill. The window. At the dark kitchen she'd been managing for 14 months. On numbers that never quite added up. In an apartment that was cold in November because she kept the heat at 62 to save $30 a month. With a brother who used an inhaler the way other kids used a water bottle constantly, casually, as a feature of existence rather than an emergency. "Nothing's wrong," she said. "I just wanted to hear your voice." Pause. The particular pause of a 12-year-old processing whether this was something to be worried about or not. "You sure? You okay?" "Yeah," he yawned. "Marcus has a really good gaming setup." "Good." She almost smiled. "Almost. I'll pick you up in the morning." "Okay." "Cece? You sound weird. I'm tired." Another pause. "Okay. Night. Night. Ev." She hung up and stood there, and then she did smile. A real one. Small and private, the kind that doesn't have an audience. She went to bed. She slept for 9 hours without waking up once, which hadn't happened in longer than she could calculate. The morning arrived, gray and cold and ordinary, and Celia moved through it the way she moved through the first hours. After any long shift methodically, without rushing, making coffee until the light changed, making coffee and eating something, and looking out the window at the street below, as if checking that it was still the same street. Cars, a dog. The man from 3C taking out recycling in his bathrobe. Ordinary. She picked Evan up at 9:30, climbed into the Civic with his backpack and his hair still flattened on one side from sleep, and immediately began telling her about Marcus's gaming setup in a level of technical detail she didn't fully follow. She drove and listened, and let the sound of his voice fill the car the way she always did, not really listening to the words, but listening to the fact of them, proof of life quality of a 12-year-old, talking about something he didn't need to be careful about. She got him home, made him breakfast, watched him eat. He looked up midway through the eggs and said, "What?" "Nothing," she said. "You're staring." "I'm not staring." "You're definitely staring." She picked up her coffee. "Eat your eggs." He ate his eggs. She drank her coffee. The radiator ticked. Outside the window, the city went about its business, and so did they in the small kitchen of the apartment on Redmond Street, and it was so ordinary it almost hurt. The fallout from that night moved through channels that Celia was adjacent to but not inside, which was the specific position she'd been asked to hold witness, not participant, and which she found, in the days that followed, to be harder than she'd expected. She wanted to know everything. She wanted the timeline, the names, the specific mechanisms by which 47 years of a criminal pharmaceutical operation got dismantled in 72 hours of legal action. She wanted to see the documentation, filed, read the complaint record, watch the pieces fall in the correct order. Patricia Moen called her on Thursday. Gideon Pike was formally charged this morning, she said. Pharmaceutical fraud, criminal extortion, evidence tampering, and 4 counts of reckless endangerment connected to patient medication deprivation. The DA's office is pursuing additional charges based on the patient cross-reference records. She paused. The 47 names from the ledger are being processed. 14 have already been contacted by law enforcement. Rand? Celia said. Dr. Rand cooperated. Moen's voice was professionally neutral, immediately and comprehensively. He provided testimony about the audit committee, mechanism, the complaint suppression process, and 3 additional physicians who were aware of the discrepancies and chose not to report them. His cooperation will be factored into his sentencing. Celia held the phone and thought about Timothy Rand, saying good morning at the charge desk at 5:15 in the morning, with his clipboard and his ordinary face, and she thought about her mother's name in his handwriting on the bottom of a dismissal letter. Will he face criminal charges? She said. Yes, Moen said. Not the same level as Pike, but yes. And the patients? The ones whose medication was diverted. Brief pause. The hospital has opened a full internal review. Patient families are being contacted, where records allow the connection to be established. It's a long process, Ms. Hartwell. I want to be honest with you about that. It won't be fast, and it won't be clean, but it's happening. She nodded. Even though Moen couldn't see her, it was the kind of nod you made for yourself. My mother's case, she said. There's enough to establish that her medication was diverted during her treatment period, and that an internal complaint about it was suppressed, Moen said. Whether that connects directly to her cause of death is a medical determination that will take longer. But the connection is documented. It's on record. It will be part of the formal review. Celia looked out the window. Thank you, she said. Miss Hartwell, Moen said, then paused, which Celia had already noticed was what she did before she said something she decided to say carefully. Debt, the Meridian Solutions account. Pike's business entities are being frozen as part of the fraud case. Any debt held by those entities is legally in suspension, pending resolution of the criminal proceedings. My strong advice, and I am giving you this as your attorney of record, which I am. As of this morning, at Mr. Rourke's arrangement is to not make any further payments until the account is formally adjudicated. At the resolution of these proceedings, the probability of that debt being discharged entirely is very high. Celia sat down. Okay, she said. Her voice was smaller than she intended. Very high, Moen said again, firmly, as if she understood that Celia needed to hear it twice. Okay, Celia said again. She hung up and sat in the apartment for a long time after that. Not on the floor this time. At the kitchen table, in the chair she always sat in, with her coffee going cold. In front of her and the electric bill face up now. Always face up now. She'd decided on the counter behind her. She sat there and she didn't cry, because the thing she was feeling wasn't the kind that came out as crying. It was something quieter than that and deeper than that. The specific feeling of a weight being shifted after so long carrying it that you hadn't known anymore what you felt like without it. Her mother's debt, her mother's name, her mother's medication, in a foam-padded crate on a hand truck going out of service. Entrance. She sat with all of it. She didn't try to resolve it or compress it or convert it into anything more manageable. She let it be exactly as large as it was. Then she got up and washed her coffee mug and went to get ready for a shift. Nora came back to ward 10 days after the arrests. Not in the same capacity, she was on modified duty, pending the outcome of the hospital's internal review, which meant she worked a reduced schedule and an administrative support role while her cooperation with the investigation was formally documented. She walked into the ward on a Tuesday morning, and the charge nurse looked at her and said nothing, and handed her a stack of files, and that was the whole of the reception. Celia was finishing a night shift when Nora arrived. They met in the hallway outside the locker room, both of them in the specific state of ships passing one coming in, one going out. Nora looked older. Not dramatically, not the way people looked older in movies. After they'd been through something. Just the small specific aging that happened when a person had been holding something for 3 years and finally put it down, not lighter, exactly, but different. Reset in some way. How's Marcus? Celia said. Good, Nora said. He doesn't know anything. I'd like to keep it that way, as long as possible. That's fair. A beat. I put in a formal statement to the review board, Nora said. About your mother. Everything I had. The complaint I filed, the dates, the cross-reference. All of it. She looked at Celia steadily. I wanted you to know I did it myself. Not because Moen asked me to, because I should have done more of it a long time ago. Celia looked at her. I know, she said. Not forgiving. Not withholding. Just acknowledging what was true. Nora nodded. I'm sorry, Celia. The hallway was quiet. A monitor beeped somewhere. The ordinary sounds of the ward. I know that too, Celia said. She went to her locker, changed out of her scrubs, walked out into the morning. She didn't hear from Cassian directly for 3 weeks. She'd expected she didn't know what she'd expected. Some kind of accounting, maybe. A conversation that addressed what had happened and what it meant and what, if anything, came next in terms of the specific arrangement between them. She was aware that expecting that was somewhat naive, given everything she knew about how Cassian Rourke operated, which was at angles, through intermediaries, in the spaces between visible things. Called once on the second week to confirm Silas called once to confirm that Gideon's 2 street-level men had been processed, and that there was no remaining organizational structure from his network that had any reason to direct attention toward her, or Evan or Nora. She said, thank you. Silas said, of course. That was the whole conversation. She went to work. She came home. She made Evan's lunch and checked his inhaler, and paid the electric bill, the full amount, the back amount, all of it at once, from money she'd been making on the extra shifts she'd been picking up, since everything fell apart, and the specific feeling of clicking, confirm on the payment portal, and watching the account balance go to zero was the closest thing to physical relief she'd felt in months. Evan noticed she was in a better mood. He said so, in the direct way 12-year-olds said things. You seem less stressed, he said one evening, not looking up from his homework. I am less stressed, she said. How come? She thought about how to answer that. Things got resolved, she said. He considered this. The money stuff, among other things. He looked up. His face had their mother's coloring, the dark eyes, the particular shape of the jaw, and sometimes looking at him was still a thing she had to brace for slightly. The way you braced for a step you knew was uneven. Are we okay? He said. Yeah, she said. We're okay. He went back to his homework. She stood at the stove and stirred something that didn't need stirring, and felt the specific truth of what she'd just said, not the performed version of it, not the version she said to keep him from worrying, but the actual true version of it. They were okay. They were, in fact, genuinely, actually okay. She wasn't sure she'd been able to say that, honestly, in over a year. Agatha Bell was discharged on a Wednesday in early December. Celia was there for the discharge, helped with the paperwork, wheeled her to the entrance where her daughter was waiting, with a car that was running with the heat already on. Agatha looked at the hospital entrance for a moment before she got in, the specific look of someone who had spent enough time in a building to feel the leaving of it. Then she looked at Celia. You fixed it, she said. Question. It's being fixed, Celia said. Agatha considered that distinction. Close enough, she said. She patted Celia's hand, once brisk, dry. The hand of a woman who had lived a long time and had learned that lingering over things didn't make them more real. You're a good nurse, she said. Thank you, Agatha. I mean it structurally, not as a compliment, as an observation. I know you do, Celia said. That's why it means something. Agatha got in the car. Her daughter drove away. Celia stood at the hospital entrance in the December cold and watched them go. And the morning was gray, and the harbor was somewhere behind the buildings, throwing its cold light at the sky, stood there until the car turned a corner and was gone. Meek. Then she went back inside. The twist that nobody had seen coming arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Gideon Pike's Fictional arrest, in the form of a formal letter delivered to Marlow County Hospital's administration from the office of an attorney Celia had never heard of. Moen called her at noon. "There's a charitable trust," she said. "It was filed 6 months ago, before any of this began. The trustees are anonymous, legally structured that way. Nothing unusual in a philanthropic context. The trust is designated for pediatric patient medication assistance at Marlow County Hospital specifically." She paused. "The initial endowment is substantial, to have run a dedicated medications fund for pediatric patients for approximately 12 years at current cost projections." Celia sat very still. "It's not from Pike's assets," Moen said before she could ask. "Predates the case entirely. It's completely clean. I checked." Another pause. "I checked 3 times. "Who filed it?" Celia said. "The filing attorney was a legitimate one, but structured for anonymity. I traced the originating authority as far as the law allows." She stopped. "Moen," Celia said. "The trust is named the Margaret Hartwell Pediatric Fund," Moen said. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and shape and temperature, the kind you could feel against your skin. Her mother's name on a pediatric medication fund at the hospital, where her mother had been a patient, where her medication had been stolen, where she had died, without the drug she'd needed. Her name on a fund that would ensure no child in that building would be denied medication because their family ran out of money. "He filed it before the diner," Celia said. "Not a question. Not making sense of it exactly. Just saying it out loud to see if saying it changed it. The dates confirm it was filed 8 months ago." Moen said quietly, "I don't know how he knew the name. I don't know how he knew the hospital. But whoever structured this knew both, and chose them deliberately." Celia pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum. She thought about a pale, gray-eyed man sitting in a diner at 4 in the morning, staring at the counter where a stranger's last $19 had been. And she thought about a sick child in a public hospital 40 years ago whose fever broke because someone on the night shift did something that nobody ever found out about. And she thought about the long, invisible line between those two moments, the way a single act of ordinary human decency moved through a life and gathered weight and traveled forward through decades and finally arrived somewhere it could do exactly the thing it had always been traveling toward. "Okay," she said, very softly. "Okay, Miss Hartwell," Moen said. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm really fine." She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she got up and took her coat from the hook by the door and walked out of the apartment and down the stairs and out onto Redmond Street because she needed air and movement and the specific grounding quality of cold pavement under her feet. She walked for 40 minutes. Through the neighborhood, past the pharmacy where she'd filled Evan's prescription, past the bus stop where she'd watched him get on the school bus 100 times, past the diner that wasn't the diner. From the first nice, but was the same kind of diner, the late-night American kind, with its particular quality of holding people who needed somewhere to be. Stopped on the corner of Harker Street, she looked at the diner with the blue awning. The awning was being replaced. 2 men on a ladder, unreeling a new canvas in a deep blue that was several shades brighter than the faded one they were removing. It looked strange and raw in the December air, too vivid for the gray day around it, the kind of blue you had to squint at. She stood there and looked at it for a while. Then she heard a voice she recognized, not the voice itself, but the quality of it, the particular stillness. She turned. Cassian Rourke was standing 20 feet away on the sidewalk with his hands in his coat pockets, watching her. He hadn't approached. He was just there. The way he was always just there, arrived without announcement, present without performance. He looked the same as he had the first night. The same tired, not sleepy quality. The same careful neutrality. The same pale gray eyes that registered her, and then went careful. She looked at him for a moment. He looked at her. "The fund," she said. He said nothing. "My mother's name," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then it was the right name. You knew about her before the diner." "No." He was direct about it. "I found out after. Silas pulled her name from the hospital records. I'd already structured the fund. I was looking for the right name for it. When I read about her, I knew." He paused. She deserved to have her name on something that undid some of what was done to her. I thought so. Celia looked at him for a long moment. Can't fix it, she said. Not angrily, just truly. It doesn't fix what happened to her. I know that, he said. She's still gone. I know. And the people in those wards, the patients whose medication was. She stopped. Her voice had gone unsteady in a way she hadn't been expecting, and she waited a moment for it to resettle. Can't give that back either. No, he said. I can't. She looked at the sidewalk between them. What I can do, he said, is make sure it doesn't happen again. In that building. To those patients. He paused. The fund runs for 12 years on the current endowment. I intend to renew it. She looked up. Something moved across his face, not the recalculating look this time. Something else. Something that had less cover over it, that looked like what it was. A man who had been carrying a debt for a very long time, and had found a way to begin paying it, not to the person he owed it to. She was gone. The nurse who'd saved him at 8 years old was probably gone. Probably had been gone for years, but to the shape of what she'd done, the category of it, the ongoing possibility that it represented. The nurse who saved you, Celia said. You never found out who she was. No. Does it matter that you never found out? He thought about that with the seriousness it deserved, the way he thought about everything fully, without shortcuts. It mattered for a long time, he said. It doesn't anymore. He looked at her steadily. I think she would have done it, whether I ever found a way to pay it forward or not. That's the point of it. That's what makes it the thing it is, instead of a transaction. She felt the echo of her own words from the first night, in that the note she'd left on the envelope returned. Accepting this would turn what I did into a transaction. She'd said that. He'd heard it. And somewhere between that night and this one, he'd understood something she hadn't fully articulated, even to herself, that the only way to honor a kindness received without strings was to give one away with equally clean hands, without keeping track, without waiting for it to come back. I have a question, she said. He waited. That first night, before you knew any of it, before Silas ran my plates, before the records, before any of it, when I paid for your food, what did you actually think? He was quiet for a moment. Thought, he said carefully, that you were the first person in a very long time who looked at me and saw a person who needed something instead of a person who could give them something. He paused. That's all. That's what I thought. She held that. It was, she realized, exactly right. Not complicated, not strategic. Just that. A person in a diner at 3 in the morning who needed something, and another person who saw it and responded without calculation. The simplest possible human transaction, and the most profound one. All right, she said. She looked at the new blue awning going up across the street, too vivid for the gray day, the 2 men on the ladder working steadily. Thank you, for Evan, for the records, she stopped. For all of it, he nodded once. Take care of yourself, Celia Hartwell, he said. You too, she said. He turned and walked down Harker Street, hands in his pockets, the black wool coat moving around him in the December wind, and she watched him go, the way she'd watched Agatha's car go, until he turned the corner and was gone. It was just the street again, ordinary and cold and ongoing. She stood there for a moment. Then she turned and walked back toward Redmond Street, toward the apartment, toward Evan's lunch waiting to be made, and the electric bill with a zero balance and the December light coming through the kitchen window, the way it always did at this hour, flat and clean and without comment. The months moved. Not fast. Months never moved fast. Whatever people said about time. They moved the way months actually moved, which was one day at a time, with the particular texture of each day, which meant that some of them were still hard, and some of them were still thin, and some of them involved Celia sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, because sleep hadn't come, and the apartment was quiet, and she was thinking about her mother, which she did regularly and without apology, because grief was not a thing you resolved. It was a thing you learned to carry, without letting it carry you. Carried it. The hospital's internal review concluded in February. The formal findings documented 26 specific incidents of medication diversion during the 3-year operational period of Gideon Pike's pharmaceutical network. 14 patients were identified, whose treatment records showed correlation with the diversion events. The hospital's legal team reached out to their families. The process was, as Moen had warned her, long and imperfect, and without the clean resolution that the word justice suggested when people used it in movies or closing arguments. All of it happened. Nora Kessler received a formal censure and a 2-year probationary status. Kept her license. She went back to full duty in March. She moved her grandson, Marcus, to a school closer to her apartment, and she walked him there every morning. And she didn't take a different route or vary the timing or look over her shoulder anymore, because there was nothing behind her worth looking at. Timothy Rand lost his license. He accepted plea agreement that included 4 years of supervised release and a permanent bar from medical practice. He moved out of Baltimore. Nobody who worked with him particularly missed him. Gideon Pike's trial began in April. It ran for 11 days. The testimony included Nora's records, the ledger, the patient cross-references, the formal statements from Moen's office, and testimony from 6 of the 47 individuals named in the ledger who had accepted cooperation agreements. On the 11th day, the jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned. Moen called Celia when the verdict came in. Celia was at work. She stepped into the stairwell to take the call. Guilty, Moen said. All primary counts. Sentencing in 6 weeks. Celia leaned against the stairwell wall. Concrete was cold through her scrubs. She pressed her back against it and looked up at the fluorescent light on the ceiling, the standard hospital fluorescent, the kind she'd been looking at for 6 years, kind that was always slightly too bright and slightly too green and made everyone look slightly more tired than they were. Okay, she said. 17 to 23 years. With the primary counts, Moen said. He'll serve the majority of it. Okay, she said again. Yes, she thought about it. Yes, actually. I am. She went back to her shift. She told Evan that night, in the simplified version, that a 13-year-old he'd turned 13 in March, had a party with 5 friends and a cake that was too big for 7 people could receive, without needing the full weight of it. The man who had Mom's debt, she said. He's in prison. Evan looked up from his phone. For how long? Long enough, she said. He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes that were their mother's eyes. The ones that always saw more than they let on. And he said, Is that the thing you were dealing with? Before? The money stuff? Part of it, she said. Is it done? Yes, she said. It's done. He nodded. Went back to his phone. Then, without looking up, good. She ruffled his hair. He made the noise of protest that was obligatory at the 13 and ducked away from it. And she laughed. A real laugh. The kind that came from the bottom of something. And the apartment held it for a moment, that sound. Her laugh in those rooms, and then it settled back into the ordinary sounds of an evening. The radiator and the television from downstairs, and the wind off the harbor coming in, cold through the window she needed to reseal before January. She made a note to reseal the window. In May, on a morning that was finally warm for the first time, in what felt like years, Celia walked to work. She didn't usually walk. The hospital was 20 minutes on foot, and she was usually either coming off a shift when it was dark or starting one when she needed to arrive clean and composed, and walking 20 minutes in hospital clothes didn't help either of those things. But it was May, and the morning was warm, and she had 40 minutes before she needed to be there, so she walked. She went past the pharmacy, past the bus stop, down the long block that ran parallel to the harbor, where you could see the water between the buildings if you looked at the right angle gray-green in the morning light, moving the way it always moved, indifferent and ongoing and permanent, in the way that large bodies of water were permanent, which was to say genuinely and without performance. Stopped and looked at it for a moment. She thought about a man who controlled 4 miles of this water front through arrangements she didn't fully understand and would never be part of. She thought about a sick 8-year-old and a night nurse who paid for his medication and went home and never knew what she'd started. She thought about $19.40 on a diner counter at 3 in the morning, and the look on a man's face when he received an act of uncomplicated human decency and didn't know what to do with it, and the long invisible line from that moment to a pediatric fund with her mother's name on it. She thought about all the people in that line, All the things that had to happen for $19 to become her mother's name permanent for one small human cheese than choice. To the dark and drive somewhere. That to travel through the dark that helped people. She didn't have a word for it. Not a clean one. She started walking again. She got to the hospital at 7:53. She changed into her scrubs. She went to the charge desk and picked up her first chart and read it the way she read every chart completely, without skimming, because every chart was a person, and every person deserved to be read completely. She went to work. She found the letter in September. It was in her mailbox on a Tuesday, handwritten on plain white paper in a small, precise hand that she recognized immediately, even though she'd only ever seen it once on the back of a pharmacy receipt, in a storage unit in Fells Point, in the small handwriting of someone under pressure who was trying to be precise. A fool, not Nora's handwriting. She stared at it for a moment before understanding arrived. Cassian's. She went upstairs. She sat at the kitchen table. She opened it. It was not long. He wasn't a person who wrote long things. Hartwell, it began, and she almost smiled at that, after everything. Still, Ms. Hartwell, the kindness you extended on the night we met was not the beginning of a debt, as I initially framed it to myself. I have been in the business of debts for a very long time, and I know how they work. They accrue, they compound, they create leverage, and leverage is a kind of power. What you gave me that night had none of those qualities. It was just a thing done by a person who could see another person clearly. I've spent a significant portion of my life in rooms where people did not see each other clearly, where everyone was a function, a leverage point, a transaction. I had accepted that as the nature of things. I was wrong about that. Or more accurately, I had let myself forget that I had once known it to be wrong. You reminded me, not by anything you said, although what you said was correct, by the act itself, by the specific character of a person who had almost nothing and gave what she had anyway, without making it about herself. My life is what it is. I'm not asking you to evaluate it or forgive it or reconcile it. I'm only telling you that whatever part of it led me here to a point where your brother is well and your mother's name is on something that will help children. I'll never meet that part. I don't regret. The woman who saved me when I was 8 years old never knew what she started. I'd like to think she wouldn't have done it differently, even if she had known, wouldn't it? That's the thing about a kindness given without strings. It travels further than you can see. It goes places you'll never go. Yours went further than you know. See, Rourke. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it against her sternum, the way you held something you wanted to feel the weight of. And she sat at the kitchen table in the September afternoon light, with the harbor somewhere beyond the buildings, and Evan's inhaler in the bathroom cabinet, and the electric bill at 0 on the counter, and her mother's name on a fund in a hospital on the 4th floor of which a night nurse had once done her job exactly as well as it could be done, quietly and without credit, and she held the letter against. Outside on Redmond Street, a kid on a bicycle went past. A dog barked once. A car found a parking space with the particular slow maneuvering that parallel parking required. Ordinary. All of it ordinary. She set the letter down on the table and smoothed it flat with her palm and looked at it one more time, at the small, precise handwriting and the plain white paper and the single initial at the bottom. Thought that somewhere in this city, a man with pale gray eyes was probably in a room making a decision about something she would never know about. And she thought that was right and correct and exactly as it should be. And she thought about a night in November when she'd had $19 and a principle about transactions. And she thought that she would do it again. She would do it exactly the same way. She wouldn't change a single thing. She got up. She started making dinner. Evan came home at 5:15, backpack over one shoulder, talking before the door was fully open about something that had happened in math class that had been either disastrous or hilarious, depending on your perspective. And she listened and asked the right questions, and handed him a glass of water, and stood at the stove while the apartment filled with the sounds of a Tuesday evening in progress, ordinary and ongoing and warm. Kitchen window was resealed now. No draft. She'd gotten to that.